Have you ever felt like no matter what you say, it is never enough? Like every conversation somehow turns into a trap where every reaction you give only fuels the fire, and in the end, you are always the one who walks away feeling completely drained and confused about what just happened. What if I told you that the real problem is not what you are saying, but the fact that you are saying anything at all, and that by the end of this you might completely change the way you deal with people who seem impossible to handle? Most people try to win against a narcissist by arguing, explaining, defending themselves, and desperately trying to prove a point. But the uncomfortable truth is that this is exactly what keeps them stuck in the same exhausting cycle over and over again. This happens because a narcissist does not feed on logic or reason, but instead feeds on reaction, where emotion becomes their currency and attention becomes their oxygen. And every time you give them either of those things, you are unknowingly giving away your power. So what do you think happens if you suddenly stop feeding them? If you remove the emotional reactions they depend on, and if you become something they simply cannot use anymore? That is where the gray rock method comes in, and even though it sounds simple at first, almost too simple to be effective, it is actually one of the most powerful psychological strategies you can apply in real life. Imagine a rock that is not shiny, not interesting, and does not stand out in any way, but simply exists without drawing attention, without emotion, and without energy. And that is exactly what you aim to become in these interactions. You become so uninteresting and so emotionally neutral that the narcissist finds nothing to grab onto, nothing to manipulate, and nothing to provoke, which completely disrupts the dynamic they rely on. And the most surprising part is that this approach actually works in a way that most people do not expect, because it does not involve confrontation, arguments, or emotional battles. But before you dismiss this as something passive or weak, it is important to understand that this is not about submission, but about controlled detachment, strategic silence, and psychological invisibility. If you think about how narcissists operate, you will notice that they constantly push buttons, provoke reactions, and test boundaries, because their goal is always to extract some kind of emotional response from you. They want anger, frustration, sadness, or even confusion, because to them, all of these reactions serve as proof that they have influence and control over your emotional state. Now imagine they try the same tactics over and over again, but instead of getting the reactions they expect, they are met with complete neutrality, with no anger, no defense, and no emotional spike at all. What happens in that moment is that the interaction starts to collapse, because without emotional input, the entire dynamic loses its foundation and begins to fall apart. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed that some people seem to get targeted much more than others in these situations, and that it never really feels random? That is because narcissists are naturally drawn to emotional energy, so if you react strongly and consistently, you become a reliable source of that energy, which makes you a target. But if you are emotionally unavailable, flat, predictable, and unresponsive, you suddenly become useless to them. And when that happens, they often move on to someone else. This is where many people make a critical mistake, because they believe that being a gray rock means being rude, cold, or even aggressive, which can actually make things worse. Strong reactions, even if they are negative, still provide the emotional stimulation that a narcissist is looking for, which means you are still feeding the dynamic. The true essence of the gray rock method is neutrality, calmness, and minimalism in the way you respond and interact. This means giving short answers without elaboration, avoiding emotional tone, and not engaging in ways that invite deeper interaction or connection. You are no longer playing the game they are trying to pull you into, and instead you are quietly stepping out of it without creating more conflict. Imagine a situation where a narcissist says something designed to provoke you, such as criticizing you or questioning your abilities in a way that feels personal and unfair. Your natural instinct might be to defend yourself, to explain your perspective, or to argue back in an attempt to correct them or protect your image. But instead of doing that, you respond with something simple and neutral, without any emotional charge behind it. There is no defense, no explanation, and no visible reaction, just a calm acknowledgement that does not feed the interaction. At that point, they are likely to push harder and try again, perhaps accusing you of not caring or trying to provoke a stronger response. and once again you respond in a flat and neutral way, without giving them the emotional reaction they are trying to extract from you. What starts to happen is that the usual script they rely on begins to fail, because the expected emotional feedback is missing. This creates confusion and frustration for them, because the interaction is no longer predictable or rewarding. And without that reward, the entire exchange starts to lose momentum and eventually falls apart. But there is a deeper level to this that most people do not consider, which is that the gray rock method is not just about how you behave externally, but also about what is happening internally. If you are still boiling with emotion inside while trying to appear neutral on the outside, it becomes very difficult to maintain this approach consistently. Over time, those internal emotions will find a way to surface, and the effectiveness of the method will weaken. True gray rock begins with a shift in mindset, where you stop seeking validation, stop needing to be understood, and stop trying to win the interaction. Because once you realize that there's no real way to win against a narcissist, everything starts to change in how you approach these situations. Your goal is no longer to convince them or prove them wrong, but to disengage completely from the dynamic they are trying to create. And that shift alone changes everything, because it removes the emotional investment that keeps the cycle alive. The reason this method works so effectively is because it targets one of the biggest weaknesses of a narcissist, which is their dependence on external validation and emotional reactions. They rely on attention to feel relevant and on emotional responses to feel powerful, so when those elements are removed, they are left without the reinforcement they need. It is similar to trying to keep a fire burning without oxygen, where eventually the flame fades and disappears. At this point, you might be wondering whether this approach is simply avoiding the problem or ignoring it altogether. But in reality, it is not about ignoring the problem, but about removing yourself from a situation that cannot be resolved through normal means. You cannot change a narcissist, but you can control how you respond to them, and that control becomes your greatest advantage. Consider another situation where someone constantly criticizes you, and every interaction feels like an attack on your character or abilities. Instead of engaging in those attacks, you respond with neutral phrases like "I see," "okay," or "got it," without adding anything further. There is no emotional investment, no attempt to defend yourself, and no effort to escalate the conversation into something more intense. Initially, they may try to escalate their behavior and push even harder in an attempt to break your neutrality and provoke a reaction. This phase is essentially a test to see if you will return to your previous patterns of emotional response. But if you remain consistent and do not break, something interesting begins to happen over time. They start to lose interest because their behavior is no longer producing the results they expect or desire. This is not just a theory, but a reflection of basic psychological principles, where behavior that is not reinforced tends to weaken and eventually disappear. However, consistency is the key factor that determines whether this method will work for you or not. You cannot apply this approach once and expect immediate results, nor can you switch between emotional reactions and neutrality without consequences. Any inconsistency resets the dynamic and signals to the narcissist that there is still a chance to extract emotional reactions from you. The gray rock method becomes effective only when it becomes your default way of interacting in these situations. You become predictable, steady, and unchanging in your responses, which removes the unpredictability they rely on. In this context, being perceived as boring is not a weakness, but a form of power that protects your emotional energy. It is also important to understand that this method is not about suppressing who you are as a person or disconnecting from your identity. You are not becoming a gray rock in every aspect of your life, but only in interactions with specific individuals who thrive on emotional manipulation. Everyone else, you can still be expressive, engaged, and fully yourself without any restrictions. But with a narcissist, you become emotionally unavailable and inaccessible in a way that prevents them from gaining control over you. This creates a boundary, and boundaries are something that narcissists tend to resist because they limit their influence. Many people find this approach uncomfortable at first because it goes against their natural instincts to respond, defend, and be heard. There is often a strong urge to correct misunderstandings, to stand up for yourself, and to make your voice count in the interaction. However, not every situation deserves your energy, and not every person deserves access to your emotional responses. Once you fully understand this, you begin to choose your responses more carefully instead of reacting automatically. That choice is where your power lies, because it allows you to control how much of yourself you give to any given situation. To make this practical, there are a few key principles to keep in mind when applying the gray rock method effectively. Your responses should be short and to the point, without unnecessary details or explanations that could extend the interaction. Your tone should remain calm and neutral, even if you do not feel that way internally at first. Your body language should not invite further engagement, which means maintaining a relaxed and neutral presence. You should avoid initiating interactions and instead allow the other person to approach you if they choose to. And most importantly, you should not try to teach them a lesson or prove a point, because that brings you back into the same dynamic. Your silence and neutrality become the message, even if it is never explicitly stated. As you begin to master this approach, you may notice that it affects other areas of your life beyond dealing with narcissistic individuals. You become less reactive in general, more controlled in your responses, and more aware of how you engage with others. This shift can improve your relationships, your work environment, and your overall sense of emotional stability. The reason many people struggle with this method is because they are deeply attached to a specific outcome. They want the narcissist to understand them, to acknowledge their perspective, but that expectation keeps them emotionally invested in a cycle that does not lead to resolution. The gray rock method requires you to let go of that expectation and accept the reality of the situation as it is. When you stop trying to change what cannot be changed, you free yourself from the frustration of constantly trying. At the beginning of this process, you may experience resistance, where the narcissist pushes harder and tries different strategies to provoke you. This is a normal part of the dynamic and should be expected, rather than feared. But if you remain consistent and do not react, they will eventually become bored and frustrated. And since they rely on stimulation and emotional responses, they will often look for that stimulation elsewhere. This creates distance between you and them, which can feel like relief after a long period of tension. That distance is what gives you space, and that space is what allows you to regain control over your own life. However, it is important to recognize that the gray rock method is not suitable for every situation, especially if there are safety concerns involved. In cases where the environment is harmful or unsafe, the priority should always be protection, support, and creating distance in a more direct way. The gray rock method is a tool, not a universal solution, and it should be used with awareness and judgment. Even in situations where the other person does not completely lose interest, the dynamic still changes in a meaningful way. They may continue to interact with you, but they no longer have the same level of emotional control over you. And that shift alone can make a significant difference in how you experience those interactions. Ultimately, this method is not about defeating the narcissist, but about removing yourself from the game they are trying to play. You stop providing the emotional supply they depend on, and in doing so you reclaim your own energy and attention. The next time you feel the urge to react or engage, take a moment to pause and ask yourself if the situation is truly worth your energy. If the answer is no, then choose to remain neutral and disengaged instead of getting pulled into the same pattern again. Because sometimes the most powerful response you can give is no response at all, and mastering that can make you emotionally untouchable.